and welcome to this reasonable facsimile of a podcast. I don't really have a lot for this one, and I am going to say up front that this is going to be the last one of these, at least for a little while. I'll get into that later on, but first the fun stuff. I wanted to see if any of you could add to this list that I've kind of started creating. I guess what got me thinking about this. Hang on. I forgot to turn off all the noisemakers. It's October, but it's October in Texas, and it's still a little warm here. But what got me thinking about this was, it was a strange road. AJ Lee returned to WWE recently, at least for one match, and Becky Lynch was involved, for those that don't know. So that's the main reason I was interested. I didn't have the burst of nostalgia others might have had when AJ Lee came out. I wasn't watching wrestling at all when she was active and winning championships. So really, I don't have anything against AJ Lee, but I don't really have anything for her either. I did have my problem with the Becky Lynch part of it, of all that, but maybe that's another topic for another day. It just started me thinking about the fact that high-profile returns are kind of a newer thing in pro wrestling. They're, of course, when I say newer, I mean this century, I guess. There have always been returns, and some of them were higher profile than others, but the return itself being this huge thing is more of a modern day thing in wrestling. And I guess the first big return I can think of when it comes to the 1980s, at least, was Gino Hernandez to Dallas. But it wasn't like this stadium-wide reaction or the centerpiece of a segment. It was a high-profile place, though. Gino made an appearance at the first David Von Erich Memorial Parade of Champions and spoke to the crowd before the mixed tag match between Chris Adams and Sunshine versus Jim Garvin and Precious. And Adams and Garvin had been feuding over the American Heavyweight Championship, and Gino challenged both of them to put the title up against him, whichever one of them had it. And that was about it. He didn't wrestle on the card. They didn't make a huge deal out of him being there, but it was a high-profile place to reintroduce him to Dallas fans. Blackjack Mulligan was another one. Of course, it had been several years since Mulligan had been in the Dallas territory. And I think that was around 1986 or 1987, maybe even 88. All those years kind of run together for me when I have nothing but my own memory to go on. Okay, I stopped and looked it up. It was 1986 when he popped back up in Fort Worth and attacked Bruiser Brody. But that was a return after several years. You had to go back to the 1970s to find the last time Mulligan had been in Dallas. And that was a different world back then. Now you have YouTube and all that reminding people who was active and what they were doing 5 and 10 years ago. Back then, a 10-year span was like a lifetime in wrestling. Most of the Dallas crowd in 1986 probably didn't remember Blackjack Mulligan his first time around in Dallas, and when he came back, it ended up not amounting to much anyway. He was there for about a month and then went to the WWF as Big Machine. As far as world class, the Freebirds left and came back a couple of times, but that last one for Michael Hayes was kind of a big deal. He came out for an actual interview, but there weren't fireworks going off or anything. Terry Gordy and Buddy Roberts came back beforehand with a new version of the Freebirds that included Iceman King Parsons. And Hayes came back, but wasn't there to wrestle. He was on tour as a musician. At least that was the story. Buddy Roberts seemed perturbed by it all, while Terry Gordy understood and wished him luck. Of course, Hayes would come back to wrestle while aligned with the Von Erichs and feuded with Gordy and Roberts. Outside of world class, Ole and Arn Anderson coming back to the NWA in 1989. Ric Flair had been having trouble with Gary Hart's stable and promised a surprise. And That turned out to be Ole and Arn. Now, of course, Arn had been in the WWF, and Ole was coming out of retirement for the umpteenth time. Or bringing up Gary Hart, that does remind me of another world-class return. Hart came back to manage Chris Adams, and at first, Hart was a babyface. Now, that was kind of weird. Of course, eventually Adams and Hart turned on the Von Erichs, and that started a long feud between Adams and Kevin Von Erich. But that got me into thinking about things they still do today, but they are done differently. And heel and face turns are, for the most part, done far differently now than they used to be. Quite often today, there is a little rhyme or reason for a turn, especially turning heel. Someone just suddenly decides they don't like someone, and boom, they are a heel. I remember just a couple of years ago, Dana Brooke was tagging with, I think it was Bayley and Sasha Banks. That tells you how long ago this was. The next night, Dana came out with 3 heels to attack Bayley and Sasha Banks. The announcers didn't blink an eye. But we do tend to romanticize the way things used to be. It was better. But it didn't always go the way things were planned, and not everything they did worked. And that is something we have to admit. It was a lot easier to hide mistakes. Now, the one that really stands out to me is Pistol Pez Whatley. This was somewhere around 1983 or 1984. Pez Whatley was being presented as the young upstart in Georgia Championship Wrestling, even though he had been around almost a decade at that point and held titles in western states and mid-America. He'd been in Georgia for 4 or 5 years at that point, but it was the early going into the mid-'80s, and there was this flood of new fans that didn't know most of that, so it was kind of given a pass. And Whatley looked younger than he was, too. But Whatley was a young wrestler that had been taken under the wing by the likes of Ole Anderson and Tommy Rich, and he comes out to face a jobber on TV one Saturday, and he got a little rough with the jobber. He choked the guy on the ropes after the bell and did some not really babyface things, and the crowd still cheered him, and all because he was one of the good guys, right? Well, he comes over to the podium with Gordon Solie and cuts this promo saying he was tired of being held down by Ole Anderson and tired of being held down by Tommy Rich, and throws out a couple of other names, and he was going in a new direction and going to worry about himself and not worry about all these overrated stars that were holding him back. And Gordon Solie kind of downplayed it, well, a very emotional Pez Whatley. Then just kind of moved on to something else. Ole Anderson came out later, didn't say a word about it. Tommy Rich or anybody else didn't say a word about it. And that was it. And back then, they aired the best of World Championship Wrestling on Sunday. And it was basically just showing old matches. But they would, have interviews with a lot of the stars. And if I remember right, they had matches every Sunday at the Omni. And that was their house shows, what was called house shows at the time. So that was just a last little bug in the ear of people in Atlanta saying, hey, you still got time to get in the car and come to the Omni. And Pez came out for an interview that Sunday, and he hadn't just finished the match, so his promo was a little less shouty. But he had the same attitude. He was wearing a suit, which you had never seen him wearing a suit. And he pushed that he was being held back and called out Ole Anderson and others by name, and then ended it saying, come out to the Omni tonight and see the new Pistol Man. And he had a match that night, but I don't remember who it was against. And again, nobody else said anything about it. Gordon Solie didn't comment. Ole Anderson came out and didn't say a word about it. And it left me sitting there thinking, what's going on with this? Then we didn't see Pez Whatley for a long time. Something like 2 months. At least we didn't see him on TV. He was probably still making house shows and spot shows. But we didn't see him on TV, and nobody ever brought him up. He finally quietly made an appearance running in to help one of the baby faces that was being attacked, and slowly worked his way back in and was the old Pez Whatley again. Babyface Pez Whatley. They just kind of pretended it didn't happen. And for a while, I wondered if as Wally just decided to do that on his own. Then somebody finally grabbed him and said, "What are you doing? You can't just decide to turn yourself heel." And the fact that it was out of the blue and nobody was responding to him, it was all just kind of weird. Back then we only knew what we saw on the wrestling show, and I assumed Whatley was something like 23 or 24 years old. As I said, they were presenting him as this young upstart. I had no idea he was in his 30s already. Now knowing what we know, things were kind of weird behind the scenes in Georgia at the time. And they seemed to be making a decision and then changing their mind a lot. They could get away with stuff like that easier at the time, so when the Whatley heel turn didn't get the reaction from fans they were expecting, they just pulled him off TV and hoped everybody just forgot it happened. Other places, another decision that didn't turn out the way the booker hoped, and one that couldn't be swept under the rug, was the Rick Rude face turn in Memphis. I still don't really get what they were thinking with that. Rude was still green at the time, but he was a good heel, and they had spent a lot of time convincing fans he was a disgusting human being. He was a woman beater. He was a coward that hid behind other people. He bashed Jerry Lawler's car in the parking lot with a baseball bat. He was a bad guy. Then they tried to turn him face. And of course fans, didn't take to it. Okay, King Kong Bundy and Jimmy Hart turned their backs on you. Sounds like a you problem. They couldn't really hide that one because he was too high profile. He had already feuded with Lawler. He was in Jimmy Hart's stable. Rude just kind of limped his way through a feud with Bundy and moved on. I think to Florida from there, and became a heel again. Vern Gagne actually turned heel in the late 1960s. That was before my time, but I couldn't find a lot of details on it because it didn't last long, and they quickly reverted Gagne back to babyface. But yeah, in the late 60s, Gagne started showing some uncharacteristic behavior, and they went into a storyline where he turned heel. It went over like a lead balloon with fans, so they just pretended it didn't happen. He went back to being the hero Vern Gagne. Sometimes there's no choice but to change things or go in a different direction, not because a booker changed their mind, but because a wrestler changed it for them. One of the more famous, I guess, instances of that is the Midnight Express feud. They turned Jim Cornette and the Midnight Express, Stan Lane, and Bobby Eaton babyface. And that was an unexpected turn in itself. A feud started between them and the original Midnight Express, which was Dennis Condrey and Randy Rose. Of course, Condrey and Eaton had been the Midnight Express with Cornette until Condrey flew the coop. And that was also the first prominent spot for Paul Heyman. Too many Pauls. Paul Heyman was still using the name Paul E. Dangerously. And he was the manager for Condrey and Rose. And I was really looking forward to that feud too, but it never really had a payoff. Dusty Rhodes was the booker, and he got fired over the spike in the eye thing with the Road Warriors. Apparently the powers that be, the TV people didn't like that, and so Dusty got fired, and I think it was Jim Crockett Jr. that stepped in as booker temporarily, and he didn't like Randy Rose's work, so he was going to replace him, which that defeated the whole purpose. The whole thing was built on the original Midnight Express, which Condrey and Rose were, and what was then the current Midnight Express of Eaton and Lane. And you take out one of the original members, and it's not the original team. So I think Rose was supposed to lose the pinfall in a tag match where whoever lost had to leave town. But before it could happen, Dennis Condrey flew the coop again, as he was known to do. So it ended up being Randy Rose and Jack Victory in the match. The closest thing that had a payoff, they had to a payoff, was the tuxedo match between Cornette and Dangerously, which was still pretty good. And all of that reminded me of another one from World Class, the loser leaves town match. Nobody really cared about. The center of it was Terry Gordy and Killer Khan. But they also wedged a sort of feud between Chic Donovan and Skandar Akbar into it. And Donovan was injured by Killer Khan when Donovan returned, he went after Akbar, who was Khan's manager, but not when Khan injured him. It was a pretty forced feud. And then they pretty much just threw in Buddy Roberts and the Missing Link to make it a 6-man elimination tag match. And everybody in the match that was pinned or submitted had to leave town. And the thing is, Killer Khan ended up leaving the territory before the match happened. And this was a match for one of the big cards. I think it was either Thanksgiving Day or Christmas Day Star Wars. And Gordy versus Khan was the main draw for the match. And they needed something big to make up for that. So they announced a mystery partner for Akbar and Link. And that turned out to be a masked wrestler they just called Mr. X. Nobody knew who it was. I think it was Mike York under the mask, but it was never revealed at the time. Everybody lost but Terry Gordy. So everybody but Gordy had to leave the territory. Nobody cared that unknown guy with a mask had to leave. It was just a popcorn fart of a loser leaves town match. But I just wanted to know if you remember any of those odd storylines or heel turns or face turns that just kind of went away. Some of the stuff that they tried to just forget about and sweep under the rug. Especially if you were able to watch any of those smaller territories like Mid-America or Portland, the stuff that didn't get much national attention. ICW, Gulf Coast, some of these territories and companies. Let's just see if we can get a little discussion in the comment section. Sorry, but that's about it. Last month I said I had been on something of an unusual schedule and I was getting back to normal. Well, that lasted long enough for me to say it. Apparently the temporary schedule is now going to be the norm for the foreseeable future. And the thing is, up to that point of what I thought was temporary, I had a schedule that allowed me to spend the majority of an entire day working on videos. Now, you may have noticed, the Hall of Fame videos I was doing. The first 3 of them came out pretty quick, and then it slowed down. And I went into that so-called temporary schedule. Well, I have now completely lost that day. This new schedule is cutting into my YouTube time pretty severely. And I made the mistake when I started the Hall of Fame stuff and when I resurrected this podcast. I was thinking I was going to have all that extra time. And that extra time is gone now. So I will have to revert back to more of the way I was doing it before. I'll still do the Hall of Fame stuff, but it may affect next year too. I had touched on a plan to have 2 votes a year, and I may just go back to doing 1, at least until I'm sure I will have the time to do everything I have on my plate. So a relatively short one to once again put this podcast at rest. I'm not going to say I'll never bring it back. It's not really a podcast anyway. It's more of a vlog. But I'll just say that I'm going to set it aside for a while and see how it goes. It really didn't get that many views anyway. Oh, I forgot to say what match we started with. Since I brought up the Midnight Express and Chic Donovan, I know I have one with all of them in it, plus Tommy Rogers tagging with Donovan. This one's probably short enough. I probably won't need any other video, but if there is, you can check the description if you want to know who is in that. Yeah, but let me know any odd storylines and turns you might remember. I'm going to take a few days to take care of some other things and then get back, get to work on a new World Class Bios. It's hard to say how long it will be before that one is ready. It all just depends on how much time I have to work on it. But thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Thanks for those of you who sat in with the podcast and participated. If this is something you enjoyed, maybe it will rise from the ashes again one day. But thanks for hanging out, and I will see you next time.